portrait announces its actual subject matter through its own chosen vocabulary before a single frame of story needs to unfold. Because a narrative that describes its central relationship using the specific images of a web being spun and a wolf circling prey is not being coy or accidentally imprecise. It is telling its audience plainly what kind of encounter this is meant to be. And any honest analysis has to take that vocabulary at face value, rather than assume the story means something gentler than the words it has chosen. Because predator and prey imagery does not describe mutual attraction, it describes a hunt. One party actively closing distance on another who has been marked, whether consciously or not, as vulnerable and targetable. And treating this framing as merely stylistic flourish rather than a genuine description of the power dynamic at play would mean ignoring exactly the information the story itself is offering. It is worth being precise about what unassuming is doing as a descriptor for Shyla in this context, because across nearly every troubling premise examined in this catalog, that word or its close relatives, naive, sweet, vulnerable, has appeared attached to whichever woman is about to be maneuvered into something she did not fully choose with complete information. And its recurrence here is not coincidental. It signals that Shyla has been selected, within the story's own internal logic, precisely because her lack of guardedness makes her an easier target. And a narrative that frames a woman's openness and trust as the very quality that makes her prey, rather than a quality deserving of protection and respect, is reproducing a genuinely troubling pattern, one that implicitly punishes women for extending good faith by having that good faith exploited, and repeatedly casting the least suspicious, least defended woman as the one who gets hunted teaches an unfortunate lesson to any audience absorbing these stories that vulnerability invites violation rather than warranting care. The employment relationship layered underneath this dynamic deserves equal scrutiny, because Bree is not simply a stranger who happens to find Shyla compelling. She is the wife of Shyla's employer, which means whatever discomfort or refusal Shyla might want to express carries the implicit risk of professional consequence, a risk that does not require Bree to ever threaten Shyla's job directly in order to function as real coercive pressure, because power imbalances rooted in employment operate precisely through this kind of ambient, unspoken risk. The employee's constant awareness that displeasing someone connected to her livelihood could cost her something significant, and a story that places its central seduction inside this specific structural context while asking its audience to read the outcome as romantic rather than coerced, is asking viewers to ignore the very real possibility that Shyla's compliance, however the story ultimately stages it, may be shaped less by genuine desire than by the accumulated pressure of not wanting to risk her employment or her employer's goodwill by resisting his wife's advances. The setup itself, a portrait sitting that becomes something else entirely once Bree redirects it toward self-expression, rather than the formal likeness Shyla presumably agreed to provide, deserves attention as its own small but significant boundary violation, because Shyla arrived for a specific, bounded purpose, to sit for a painting. And the story depicts Bree unilaterally expanding the terms of that arrangement without Shyla's clear prior agreement, using her authority and charisma to redefine what the session is actually for once Shyla is already there, already sitting, already inside a room and a situation she did not choose in its final form, and this kind of after-the-fact redefinition of an agreement, changing what someone consented to once they're already committed to being present, mirrors real-world patterns of manipulation, in which initial consent to one thing becomes leveraged into an expectation of consent to something else entirely, and Shyla's reported attempt to maintain her dignity throughout this process, only to have that dignity described as being systematically broken down step by tension-filled step, should be read as exactly what it sounds like: sustained pressure applied to someone's resistance until that resistance gives way. Not organic mutual desire building between equals, but calculated erosion of one person's boundaries by someone with more power in the room. Bree's own dialogue, insisting she isn't asking for Shyla's heart and won't toy with her the way other women apparently did, deserves particular scrutiny, because it performs reassurance while doing nothing to actually address the coercive structure of the encounter, since claiming not to want emotional attachment does not make pursuing someone through calculated pressure and structural leverage any less concerning. If anything, it suggests Bree views Shyla's interior emotional life as beside the point entirely, something to be explicitly waved away rather than genuinely considered. Which is a troubling admission dressed up as tenderness. A woman announcing that she doesn't need Shyla's heart to be engaged in whatever she's pursuing, only some other kind of access. And a narrative that presents this as reassuring rather than alarming has badly miscalculated what actual care and respect for another person's interiority would sound like. What this story gets fundamentally wrong, and what elevates it above simple bad romantic writing into something worth naming critically is its apparent belief that intensity and pressure are romantic substitutes for consent and mutual recognition. That circling someone like prey, breaking down her stated boundaries, and reassuring her that at least your intentions aren't as bad as some unnamed previous woman's constitutes a love story rather than a chronicle of someone's resistance being worn down by a more powerful party. And this conflation matters because it reflects a broader and persistent cultural confusion about the difference between passionate pursuit and coercive pressure. A confusion that shows up across genres and orientations, but carries particular weight in stories about women loving women, because these stories already carry the burden of representing an underrepresented form of intimacy responsibly, and when they instead borrow uncritically from predator-prey and hunting language to describe desire, they risk suggesting that authentic queer intimacy, too, is best understood through the lens of one woman's calculated conquest of another's resistance, rather than through the more difficult, more valuable narrative work of depicting two people recognizing and choosing each other freely. A genuinely worthwhile version of this premise would need to dismantle almost every structural element currently in place, removing the employment entanglement, so that whatever happens between Shyla and Bree cannot be shadowed by professional risk, replacing the hunting imagery with language that reflects actual mutual curiosity and equally shared vulnerability, rather than one woman's calculated approach and another's eroding resistance, and allowing Shyla's own desires and boundaries to shape the direction of their time together rather than having her arrive for one clearly bounded purpose, only to have that purpose redefined around her. Because the raw materials here, an artistic setting, the intimacy inherent in being truly seen and rendered by another person's careful attention, the vulnerability of sitting still while someone studies you closely enough to capture you on canvas, actually contain real potential for a story about authentic recognition and slowly built trust. But that potential can only be realized once the story stops speaking in the language of hunting and starts speaking in the language of two people meeting each other as equals, each free to look away, to decline, to set the terms of her own exposure, without the shadow of professional consequence or calculated pressure determining how much of herself she ultimately feels safe enough to reveal.